When I was still a university student, I had a close friend named Waiko. She was a friend I'd made after starting university, but I loved to talk and she was great at listening, so we soon became good friends. But during the second autumn after we started university, Waiko fell ill. Sickly to begin with, she got worse before our eyes, and each time I went to see her, I could tell she was getting weaker and weaker. One day she said to me, "I wish we could have graduated together." And seeing her like that, I was unable to stop the tears, crying in front of her. Why did this have to happen? Why did this have to happen to Waiko? I couldn't accept the reality of it, but Waiko smiled gently at me. The fact that we met, that we are friends, that won't change. And even if I die, I'll forever be in your memories, she said. That winter, she died. After her funeral, I was still unable to accept the reality of the situation, and before I knew it, New Year's Eve had ended, and New Year's Day had come. While I was depressed, a single New Year's card arrived. Happy New Year. I'm so glad we met. This year, and the year after that, let's always remain friends. It was from Waiko. I'd heard of future mail before, so I soon realized that she must have sent it before she died. Thinking that I'd never be able to talk to her again, I bawled my eyes out. But it wasn't out of sadness. The following year, another New Year's card arrived. You'll be graduating this year, huh? Finding a job will be difficult, but just do your best for a little longer. They were busy times, but the card from Waiko saved me. I safely found work, and the following year, as the sadness from Waiko's death was fading, it arrived. Congratulations on your new job. Looked like you were so busy last year that you couldn't even take a break. Well done. I'd gotten New Year's cards from her 3 years in a row. But this one wasn't sent to my family home address, but rather straight to my new place in Tokyo. You have a new boyfriend now, right? How nice. I hope I can find a nice boyfriend soon too. The 4th year, somehow, she knew that I had made my first boyfriend. Something else was written at the end. Next New Year's, let's go out again together. Just the two of us. Today is New Year's Eve, and it's 11:59. Only one more minute until the new year. This happened when I went to visit my father's family home for New Year's when I was a junior high student. His family home was in the countryside, and for me, a kid raised in the city, there were unusual sights all around. Having said that, we'd been going there every year since I could remember, so I was starting to get bored with it. Not much had changed, but I saw a group of people in mourning clothes that must have been going to a funeral or something. Whenever my grandfather saw me, he'd always say things like, "Haven't you grown tall?" and "Are you studying hard?" I answered him non-committally and we moved on. We also ate dinner at my grandfather's house. It was New Year's, so there were all sorts of New Year's food spread out before us. But amongst that was some food I'd never seen before. At a glance, it looked like regular miso soup, with radish and meat in it. But when I tried it, it tasted different. It was tasty, but something about it was different. Then I noticed my grandfather looking at me. "What?" I asked, and he said, "Is the soup good?" Afraid he would say something strange, all I said was, "It's good." "Good, good." He nodded his head, satisfied, and I tilted mine. We used to get this miso soup every now and then when I was a kid as well, but they never told me what's in it, my father said. "Come to think of it," he continued, "there used to be a custom here in the past of culling children. In the Edo period, apparently all the parents would gather and eat the children's flesh," he said, waiting for my reaction. I was used to his bad taste jokes, so I decided to ignore him. But then, I suddenly remembered lunchtime. The gathering of people in mourning clothes who had perhaps just been to a funeral. I wanted to know more, so I asked my grandfather about it. Have any of our relatives died recently?" My father grinned and said, "So you believe me, huh?" But I ignored him. Well, I don't really know about that," he replied. Relieved, I ignored my father and continued eating as he made fun of me. Then my grandfather suddenly muttered something. "This is a small area after all. We probably were related somewhere." He smiled at me as I looked up. The miso soup with something in it was right in front of me. Even now, I still don't know what was in that miso soup I had. This happened when I was still a child. There was a shrine near my family home, and there was a large rock there that people called a goshintai, or body of a god. They said that if you prayed to that rock, you would be blessed with children. But amongst the local children, there was a game where they tested their courage by seeing who could climb the highest on that rock. The rock was inside a building, and most would get caught on the stairs, but even if they reached the top, they would always get found before they got too far in. But one day, several of my classmates went to try it, and luckily, they weren't found and got into the building. I'm a girl, but as a kid, I tended to play more with boys than other girls, so I joined them as they tried to climb the rock. But I got careless halfway up, and my foot slipped, sending me tumbling down. I collided with the rock, grazing myself all over, and hit the floor. It hurt so much I cried before I could stop myself, and in the distance, we heard the angry voice of the priest, so we panicked and ran. Thankfully, I didn't injure myself too badly, but there was just one thing I was concerned about. Perhaps some germs had gotten into the scratch on my knee, because it was strangely swollen. The raised flesh wriggled strangely, just like the crying face of a baby. It was so creepy that I didn't want other people to see it, and I kept quiet about it from my parents. But it wouldn't heal, and it began to irritate me. I squished it with my finger. It didn't especially hurt, but weird liquid came out of it like a regular blister, and once it had broken, it disappeared. Time passed, and I got married to a colleague and gave birth. He was a healthy baby boy with no problems, and then our day to leave the hospital arrived. As my husband was driving us home, I suddenly experienced déjà vu. The smiling expression on my son's face. It was like I'd seen it somewhere long ago. When I tried to tell my husband about it, we had an accident. Another car ignored the traffic lights and hit us from the side. Our car was crushed, the glass on the side that had been hit all smashed, and the rear door pierced through. Miraculously, I was okay, but my son in my arms was... Then I remembered. The strange blister I'd popped when I was a child. My son's crushed face looked just like that. This happened during the summer vacation of my 3rd year in high school. I went to summer lessons at cram school with my friend every day. One day after class, several of us went to karaoke, a family restaurant, for dinner, and we were on our way home as the sun was setting. But unfortunately, it began to rain, and before we knew it, it turned into a downpour. My friend who lived nearby was already home, and my other friend said he was going to run home, leaving me alone. I had to take the bus home, so I put my bag over my head and ran. I ran to the bus stop and finally relaxed under the roof, but I hadn't noticed someone was already there. Just like me, she sat alone on the bus stop bench. My classmate, Kami. We weren't especially close, but I thought it would be strange if I didn't say anything to her, so I said, "Amazing rain, huh?" Then she slowly turned to look at me. Her eyes were vague and unfocused. Finally, she gave a small nod and returned to staring into space. I didn't want to start talking to her again, so I moved slightly away from her and watched her. The sound of falling rain echoed loudly, and it was so heavy that I could barely see ahead of us. But the bus stop where Kami and I sat was wrapped in silence, like being in the eye of a typhoon. She continued staring into space, unmoving, and combined with the strange quietness, I felt my throat getting dry. Before long, a single bus arrived. Most of the buses that stopped there went near my house, so I got on. But then I noticed something strange. The step leading to the bus driver's seat was oddly high, and I struggled to see him. No matter how I looked at it, I couldn't see him. Confused, I just stood there. Then Kami brushed past me and got on the bus. Then she turned to me to say something, and her lips moved. After several seconds of silence, the bus Kami got on left. All I could do was watch it go. When I got home, I remembered what she'd said. "Are you coming?" She said something like that. The next day, I heard that Kami had fallen into an overflowing river and died. We stayed in a hotel for our school trip during high school. It was one of those places that looked like it could be haunted. And, being that we were on a school trip, we started talking about taking a look around. We got a thrill trying to escape from our room without the teachers on patrol seeing us, so everyone was having fun right from the start. But not even 10 minutes had passed before we were already bored. Nothing strange at all had happened, so we quickly ended our search. The moment we all agreed to end it, the girl next to me said something. "The door to this room is open." When I looked, it really was open, and I peeked into the darkness inside. "You want to go in?" someone said, and so we nervously entered the empty room. One of my friends took out his phone and shone a light around the room. The floor was made of tatami mats, and various unused items were placed around the room. It was all stuff that wasn't used anymore, and amongst it all, I found something strange. At the far end of the room was an old 3-sided mirror. As though pulling us in, we all stood before it. Our faces reflected in the darkness, but that was all. Or so I thought, when at that very same moment, Eiko screamed next to me. We were surprised, but Eiko screamed. There was something strange in the mirror, although we had no idea what she was talking about. Thanks to her scream, the teachers found us and got angry, and the day ended just like that. A few days later, after our school trip was over, things had gone back to normal, when suddenly I got a call from Eiko. She'd been away from school the last few days, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said, "Someone's in the mirror. They're getting closer." I had no idea what she was talking about, but before long, she seemed to give up and then hung up on me. I wondered if I'd done something wrong, but I really had no idea. But a few days later, Eiko returned to school like nothing had happened. "Are you okay?" I asked, to which she answered, "I'm a little tired." Life after that continued as though nothing had happened, and after we graduated, we still kept in contact with each other. But there was one thing that still bothered me. Eiko was left-handed, but at some point, she started using her right hand instead. Just what did she see in the mirror? There are anonymous bulletin boards on the internet, right? One of those threads became a hot topic amongst junior high school girls. Apparently, if you wrote your wishes in the thread, they would come true. I wasn't interested in such things, but that same rumour spread through the junior high I went to, and several people, including my classmates and close friends, said they wrote in it. One of my childhood friends, T, was also interested in it, and she asked me to write something in it with her. Whenever she did something, she always asked me to join her, and when I mentioned it, she would cling to me, but it didn't really bother me. Then I came over, who I'd become good friends with since we were in the same class. I was the type of person to act before thinking, the exact opposite to T, but the three of us often hung out together. So, the three of us decided to ask for something together. First, I wrote asking for good marks on the upcoming test. That's very matter of fact, I said. And I said that she got bad marks on the last test, so if it happened again, she'd lose her pocket money. T, on the other hand, asked for us to be friends forever. I made fun of her for acting so high and mighty, but ever since she was a kid, T always thought of her friends first, so I understood where she was coming from. As for me, I couldn't think of anything I wanted, so I decided to leave it for another day. A short while later, I don't know whether it was because she wrote on that board or not, but I got good marks on her test. Then, on the same day, it happened. I's house caught on fire, and everyone in her family died in their sleep. At first, I didn't believe it, but after I's funeral, the reality began to finally sink in. T was the one who tried to cheer me up. She said that if I was sad, then I would be sad too. As she consoled me, I slowly came to terms with I's death. I started to think that I had to live for her as well. Then T said something to me about our wishes from that day. Let's be friends forever. Even now, as adults, T and I are close friends. There's a body buried beneath that cherry blossom tree. It's a common saying, right? It's something like that. There's a rumor like that in my town as well. There's a dead body buried beneath that beautiful cherry blossom tree. That's why you can't dig under it, they say. I was in the 2nd grade of high school at the time. There was a place famous for cherry blossom trees near my high school. There was one tree amongst them all that was more brilliant than all the rest, or so they said. My boyfriend invited me, as a joke, to go and confirm whether there really was a dead body buried beneath that tree. Late at night, both of us dug at the tree's roots. It was hard, and I threw in the towel after a few short minutes. But my boyfriend continued digging. It wasn't yet April, so the temperature dove as night fell, and I trembled in the cold. "Let's go home," I said, but it was like he was possessed and wouldn't stop digging. I got creeped out and shut my mouth, but then suddenly, my boyfriend gasped in surprise. I peeked into the hole, wondering what he had found, when there was something white on the end of his shovel. At the bottom of the hole appeared to be human bones. We were too scared to leave things how they were, so we alerted the police. They got angry at us, but at the same time, I was also relieved. I later heard that the bones belonged to someone who had gone missing the previous year. I wish that was the end of the story, but it's not. My boyfriend started acting strange after that. He would always space out, and then before you knew it, he would have disappeared, having gone to look at the tree. His eyes looked possessed, just like that day he dug up the bottom of the tree. Then, in December of that year, he went missing. His parents and the police searched all over, but they couldn't find any leads. Then, in March, a new season rolled around. The cherry blossom tree in question once again bloomed vividly, and when I saw it, I dug beneath it, just like that day. For a moment, I found nothing. But after digging about 10 or 20 centimeters down, the shovel hit something white. I gulped, and then carefully moved the dirt aside. What I saw was a human skeleton, wearing clothes I knew all too well. This story happened to my friend, S. She made videos for the internet with her boyfriend. They made all different types, but the most popular were when they visited ghost spots. S didn't like ghosts, but people liked her genuine reactions, so they continued making them to keep viewers. The place they chose this particular video was a so-called incident house. An acquaintance introduced them to the place and said that someone had committed suicide there in the past. S and her boyfriend were to spend a week there, and then stream live during the night. On the first day of streaming, they talked about how it felt being there, and as they were about to end with nothing of note happening, they saw a particular comment. "There's something behind you," it said. Other commenters also reacted, and S also looked into the screen to see something behind them. "There's nothing there," S said, and the commenters split into two sides. Some said they could see nothing, and others said they could see something. But in the end, they finished streaming before anything happened. For the stream the following day, S clearly hadn't slept enough. She would hear noises as she tried to sleep, and it bothered her so much that what sleep she did get was only light. As they were streaming, they got comments that people could hear a voice coming from somewhere. Of course, there were people who felt the same, and others who said it was just their imagination. S was shaken, but following her boyfriend's lead, she calmed down, and they continued filming as usual. On the third day, S said she could hear someone speaking during the night. She had bags under her eyes and said she couldn't sleep. That day, they got a comment that there was a shadow behind them. Day by day, S was worn out, and the comments constantly reminded her of the supernatural. They increased more and more, and on the sixth day, those who disagreed had dwindled in number. On the seventh day, S was acting strange from the very start, and during the stream she chatted about things that made no sense. And then finally, she said, "It's watching me," and committed suicide. People claimed it was the ghost's curse, but according to the investigation, at the time of the comment, there were no mysterious shadows or sounds. They later found out that the first person who made the comment had also only been joking. In other words, S had fallen for a joke and freely taken her own life. Perhaps the most terrifying thing isn't ghosts after all. This happened when I was in high school. I took the train to the closest station near school every morning, and there was a person I always saw. He was a boy about my age, but he was always looking at the ground and looked to be brooding over something. He always looked like that when he got on the train, but strangely, I never saw him inside. The train was always full, so I told myself I just lost sight of him, or perhaps he moved to another car. So on this day, when I saw him, his face down and looking increasingly more pale than usual, my eyes followed him. He stood at the front of the line for the train, alone, and appeared to be trembling. I stood behind him, and finally, the train arrived. The announcement played over the speakers, and the train approached. Then, as I kept my eyes glued to him, he jumped onto the tracks. I was shocked for just a moment, and then instinctively grabbed his hand. More than me keeping my eyes on him, it felt like some strange power had pulled me. The next moment, he disappeared right in front of my eyes. Huh? I opened my mouth in surprise and was thrown into the air. Although it all took place in an instant, I watched it like it was happening in slow motion. He smiled amongst the shocked faces watching as I suddenly fell forward. Well, I'm here telling you this story now, so I was okay in the end. Luckily, I was able to escape beneath the platform and didn't even suffer any injuries from my fall. I graduated from high school the next day and moved away, so I never saw him again. But according to what a friend told me later, apparently a boy who was being bullied once committed suicide at that station. That alone wouldn't be anything special, and maybe it's just a coincidence, but apparently the kid who bullied him also jumped in front of a train at that same station. They died, but a few days before they did, they apparently said something. He's here, looking at me. He's looking at me, smiling. After that, numerous people said they saw a boy standing on the platform, looking at the ground, before he jumped onto the tracks. This happened when I moved to Tokyo. I moved from the countryside to Tokyo to attend university, so I rented a cheap apartment and began living by myself for the first time. I got a part-time job, and being able to pay for my own things made me feel like I'd become an adult, and my new lifestyle proceeded smoothly. Aside from the nightmare I had each night. It was spring, so if I opened the window, a cool breeze would blow in and it wouldn't feel so hot. That would change when night fell and I slept on my bed. The first time I had it, I instantly knew it was a dream. I was lying in bed, looking at the roof. It was the roof of my first apartment that I'd finally gotten used to seeing. But it was so hot. Hot like my body was cooking. My throat was dry. I couldn't stop sweating, and I couldn't even stand up. Even though I knew it was a dream, I couldn't help but think that I was going to die, just like that. It was so hot that deep inside felt like I was burning. Then I woke up. I realized I was covered in sweat. At first, I thought my nerves were fried because I wasn't used to living alone, but the nightmares continued. After that, I started to sleep with the air conditioner on, but nothing changed. The nightmare would wake me up, and when I checked, the air conditioner was still on. So it should have been impossible for me to be that hot. I spoke to the landlord about how strange it was, but the elderly man just looked at me surprised and told me about a famous faith healer. As soon as the healer entered my apartment, she immediately noticed something. "You should move your bed." I didn't know what that would change, but after that, the nightmares stopped. The landlord later explained to me. The person living in the apartment above mine had died of heat stroke the summer before. It was the hottest day on record, and they had no air conditioner, so by the time they were found dead several days later, the body had mummified. The landlord explained that my nightmares might have been a result of sleeping beneath the lingering malice of that resident who died. Maybe that person is still suffering from the heat and unable to escape, even now.
When I was an elementary school student, several of us friends went to play at Seiko's house. She lived with her parents and grandparents. Her grandparents' house was being enlarged and Seiko's house was rather big, so being that it was our first time there, we decided to play hide and seek. Her mother told us that anywhere besides the bedrooms was okay, so we started right away. I walked around the house, wondering where to hide. Then my eyes suddenly fell upon a room hidden behind a sliding door. All of the other rooms had regular doors, but this one had a sliding door, so I reached out to open it, curious about what was inside. It was a regular, normal Japanese-style room. I later heard that particular room wasn't part of the renovations. I decided to hide in there and went inside. The only place I could hide was the closet, so I opened the door. As I did, something felt strange. I was the only person in the room, but I could feel someone looking at me. The sliding door was closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling, so I looked around and then spotted it. There was a doll on the floor. It was the doll of a girl, and it was looking at me. "Just a doll," I sighed, and got into the closet. As I went to close the door, I locked eyes with the doll, but I ignored it. I could hide in the darkness. I listened for the footsteps of the person coming to find us. If I stayed quiet, I'd be able to hear. I heard something fall over. I thought she was here and prepared myself, but it seemed I was wrong. I opened the door to check. Something like a stick of candy was lying on the floor next to the doll. It seemed to be an offering for the doll. That's odd, I thought, and then realized something. If that was on the ground, why was the doll still standing? And somehow, the doll seemed closer to the closet now. Maybe I was just imagining things, I thought, but I got scared and ran. I didn't enter the room again after that, but I asked Seiko about the doll. According to her, it had been passed down through the generations, and it had the hair from her dead ancestors sewn into it, so it was like a family guardian angel. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed hidden in that closet. This happened when I was in university. I had a boyfriend at the time, and one day, my friend Eiko asked me to go out to a mixer with her. Of course, I tried to refuse her, but Eiko pressured me, saying I would make the numbers perfect, so I agreed on the grounds that I wouldn't hook up with another guy. They were from a nearby university, and it was the first time for everyone to meet. Someone by the name of Y sat across from me. He had a nice smile, and looked like a charming young man that you might see anywhere. Eiko, sitting next to me, pointed out that he was my type, but I already had a boyfriend, so I wasn't interested. When we were done with introductions, Y and I spoke like close friends, even though we had only just met, and it oddly didn't feel impudent, and when Eiko joined us, he spoke to her in the same way. Then one of the other guys spoke. By the way, did you guys hear about the murders taking place around here recently? It had been on the news, a brutal killer who targeted young women. All of the victims had died, and according to the police, they had been alive while their limbs were cut off. Maybe he was trying to scare us to get our attention. But while it was a terrible crime and I hoped they would find the killer soon, it wasn't really my concern, so I didn't think much of it. Then Y asked me something. "Do you think it's scary?" he said. I debated what to say, but I answered, "I do, but there's not much I can do about it." "Right?" he smiled, as though satisfied with my answer, and that was the end of that. When the party was over, everyone went to those they liked to get their numbers and return home. Y came to speak to me. "I know a nice bar nearby," he said, "but I was meeting my boyfriend after, so I refused." Eiko, who heard us talking, said she wanted to go. Y smiled and nodded. I saw the two of them off and went to see my boyfriend. Then, 2 days later, they found Eiko's dead body. The murderer was the man who sat across from me. Y. If I hadn't refused Y that night, I probably wouldn't be here right now. I'm not very good at taking photos. No, to be honest, I'm scared of them. It all began when I was a student. At the time, I really wanted a smartphone, so I made a promise with my parents that I would do well on my test if they got me one, and so they got me one second-hand. Having studied hard and gotten myself a smartphone, I lost myself uploading photos to SNS, which I'd always had an interest in. I figured that any photo I uploaded would get a huge response, but then I noticed something. Normally all of the data on a phone is erased when you get it secondhand, but mine still had several pictures left in it. Interested, I opened them to see a stranger, and they weren't very interesting, so I went to delete them. Then I saw it. The same shadowy figure was in all the photos. In the background of the city. In the shadows of the former owner's house. It's possible that the former owner and the shadowy figure knew each other, but the way the figure looked at them, it didn't appear to be kind. It was like a reptile after its prey, not the type of way a person would look at another person. Creeped out, I deleted the photos and went about my life trying to forget that I had seen them. One day, I uploaded a photo to SNS like always, and I got a message. "It looks like there's a ghost in the background," it said. I checked the photo right away, and there really was a figure in it. I panicked, and I checked my other photos, and starting from the day I deleted those photos, it was now in mine. And it was slowly getting closer. At first it was hidden far in the crowds, but in the most recent picture, it was only a few meters away, looking at me like it was about to devour its prey. Scared, I quickly sold the phone, and ever since then, I've been too scared to appear in pictures. So I don't know what's going on with that figure now. Maybe it's right behind me, looking at me with those eyes. This is a story told in my hometown. There are several mountains in my hometown, and amongst those, there's an area that people say you should never go near. They say a demon lives there. When I was a junior high student, several of my friends entered the place to test our courage. The entire area was surrounded in sacred rope, but it was easy to get in. They said a demon lived there, but nothing happened, so we quickly got bored and decided to leave. It was nighttime in the mountains, so our torches only let us see a few meters ahead. But there were several of us together, so we didn't feel scared, and then we finally reached the border. Then, as we ducked under the sacred rope, Keiko screamed. She said something had stabbed her ankle. Looking at it, we could see that blood was pouring from a deep cut. We looked around, wondering if it was a snake, but we couldn't see anything like that. In the end, some boys helped Keiko up and away from that place. She went to the hospital, and they checked her wound, but they said it looked fine, so we decided not to say anything about our trip. Then, a few days later, Keiko started to show changes. She complained of terrible stomach pains. That soon calmed down, but then she started suffering from anemia. She'd pass out during class and often went home early. She also clearly started losing weight. Her cheeks grew gaunt, and she didn't look normal. One day she passed out in front of me and went home early, so I went to visit her. I'd known her for a long time, so her parents knew me as well. Her mother told me at the entrance that Keiko hadn't been feeling well since that morning, so she was resting in her room. She said it would be fine for me to see her, so I made my way to her room alone. I opened the door, like I had done as a kid. I found Keiko lying in a pool of blood. Her stomach cut wide open. I screamed. Nobody knew what it was that directly killed her. But according to her mother, the police said that they found part of Keiko's insides missing. It was like something had eaten its way out of her.
Have you ever heard of Nikkari-san? That's the word that every single child in my hometown has heard at least once. And if somebody asks you that, you have to answer that, yes, you have. I don't know why, but we hear it from our parents, who heard it from their parents, and so on and so forth. And so, everybody knows. We used to make a game of it, and if you couldn't answer, then you'd have to face a punishment game or something. It wasn't something we thought about very deeply. One day, I was playing with Fko, who had just transferred to our school when my friend Siko came over and asked me that very same question. Have you ever heard of Nikkari-san? I have, I answered, but Fko looked confused and answered, I haven't. Normally this would result in a small punishment, but this time around, Siko said to her, then I'll tell you. I was surprised and thought about asking her myself, but Siko said that she could only tell one person, so I kept my mouth shut. A few days later, Siko went missing. She was always a bright, cheerful kid, the class mood maker, so a heavy atmosphere enveloped us. At the time, Fko tried to cheer us up. She was rather quiet and mature when she first transferred, but she looked a lot like Siko as she tried to cheer us up, and her smile looked just like her as well. Now that we've all grown up, I still run into Fko every now and then, and every time she smiles, it reminds me of Siko. And not too long ago, Fko asked me, have you ever heard of Nikkari-san? Which made me remember that Siko told her what that meant when we were kids. So I asked her, can you tell me? So she's coming over to my house tomorrow. Apparently, it has to be just the two of us, like when Siko told her long ago. When she said that, a smile appeared on her lips that looked exactly like Siko's. My father likes collecting things, so there are all sorts of items back at our family home, one of them being a black phone. It no longer works, but my father likes retro items, and so he uses it as a decoration in his room. When I was still a child, my bedridden grandmother who lived with us said something to me one day. The phone is ringing. I was bringing her the food my mother prepared for her, but I didn't hear any noise. And so I said to her, but the phone isn't ringing. Then my grandmother answered, it's coming from your father's room. Can't you hear it? I didn't understand what she was talking about. I mean, the only thing in my father's room was that broken black phone. My grandmother died a short time later, but before she did, she often complained that she could hear the phone ringing. Several years later, about 10 years ago now, I started junior high school. I invited my friend Esco over to my house and we worked on our homework together. But she seemed restless and it weirded me out a little, so I asked her what was wrong. Then she said, "The phone has been ringing all this time. Aren't you going to answer it?" "What do you mean?" I asked, no idea what she was talking about. She said that ever since she stepped inside the house, that a phone was ringing, and it was still ringing at that moment too. I couldn't hear any phone, so I told her that maybe she was just imagining it. But still she complained. "No, I'm not imagining things. It's still ringing." Just in case, I went to check the phone in the living room, but then Esco said, "Not that one. It's coming from that room over there." She pointed to my father's study, where, you guessed it, that black phone was. At that moment, I remembered what my grandmother said when she was still alive, and a bad feeling washed over me. A few days later, Esco was involved in a car accident and passed away. That made me realize something. That black phone seemed to ring whenever someone was close to death. A few days ago, I visited home for the first time in a while, and I heard that phone ring. The black phone in my father's study. You might end up being the last person I ever speak to. This happened when I was a university student. I loved driving the car I bought with the money I saved from my high school part-time job, and one night I went out driving again. Then it started snowing outside, so I panicked and decided I had to quickly go home. That was why I noticed just a moment too late the person walking over the pedestrian crossing. Let me preface this so that there are no misunderstandings. It's not like I ignored any traffic lights, and there really hadn't been anyone in front of me either. Realizing that I had hit someone, I immediately stopped the car. There was nobody else around and I was dumbfounded by what had just happened, so I briefly considered fleeing the scene, but I managed to stop and decided to get out of the car and first check to see if the person was okay or not. I opened the door with a trembling hand, nervously looked around, and there was nothing there. I had most definitely hit something, and yet, when I looked around, all I could see were some footsteps in the snow. But the owner of those footsteps was nowhere to be seen. Thinking I must have imagined it, I got back in the car and drove straight home. My parents were away on business at the time, so I parked the car in the garage and took a moment to calm down. Had I really just imagined it? I convinced myself that I was just exhausted from driving, and then got out of the car. At that moment, I heard the sound of someone walking over the snow. Working on a hunch, I rushed to the road in front of the house and looked down the way I had just come. Next to the tire marks in the snow, there were also footprints. They suddenly stopped and ended right on the spot. I got chills and rushed into the house, locked everything behind me, and then dove under the covers on my bed. And then I realized that I wasn't just trembling because of the cold. Morning arrived the next day without incident. First thing I did was check everything was still locked. Thankfully, it was. And then, thinking that maybe everything had been the product of an exhausted dream, I opened the front door, and there were countless footprints in the snow that seemed to go all around the house. I later heard that there was something on that road I passed that would follow you home. It wasn't like anything happened to me after that, but I never used that road again. Maybe that thing is still there, after all. In my hometown, there is a large pond where the Master lives. I say pond, but it's basically a lake, and this pond in the middle of a park has lots of fish in it, but one of those fish is very clearly larger than all the others. When I was in elementary school, my classmate Waita said he was going to catch the Master, and several of us went to watch him do it. Waita was the type to get easily carried away by things, and most of us went just to make fun of him when he inevitably failed. But unexpectedly, he caught the fish. Waita jumped over the fence surrounding the pond and cast his line, and about 30 minutes later, the line started moving wildly. Waita gripped it and tried to pull it up, but it didn't budge. We could see a large shadow under the surface of the water. At that moment, Waita screamed, "Crap! It's going to pull me in!" For a moment, I briefly wondered what type of fish could pull a person, even an elementary school kid, and then Waita started leaning forward. One of the boys with us jumped over the fence to help him, but then Waita fell into the water. Several friends ran to call some adults, while the rest of us looked through the water for Waita. Ripples spread out where he fell in, but we couldn't tell if he was there or not. But we simply called out his name, unable to jump into the deep water after him. Then, Waita's upper torso suddenly burst through the surface of the water. Struggling, he said, "Help me! A monster has..." The very next moment, he sank under the water again, and the area fell silent. We just stared in disbelief until the adults arrived. The search lasted for 2 days, continuing until they found his body lying on the shore. It might sound like Waita simply drowned in the pond, but that wasn't what really happened. His body had been damaged, like something had eaten it, and they were unable to find the missing parts. It was a large pond, sure, but there weren't even rumours of some large man-eating creature that might reside in it. So, an investigation was then carried out. As a result, they found numerous human bones lying at the bottom of the pond. However, they were unable to find the creature that attacked Waita. Even now, we still don't know what that large creature was. Looking into it, it turned out that there were occasionally disappearances in the area surrounding the pond. What on earth resides in that pond? I still don't know whether I should tell this story or not. There are a lot of videos on the internet that you're not supposed to watch, right? When I was a student, I used to watch these a lot, and one day I found a particular video. In this video, a clown was walking around a city performing tricks, and every now and then, it would look right at the camera. There are some people who are afraid of clowns, but I wasn't one of them, so I didn't think the video was especially scary. However, it all started after watching that video. The next day, I could see a clown hanging around on the edge of my vision. It didn't do anything. It wasn't even watching me or getting any closer. However, it was most definitely there on the peripheries, and sometimes it was right behind me or even right in front of me, smiling. At first, I thought I was just tired, but when I went to bed that night, I could feel another presence in the room with me, and for several days, I was unable to sleep. Then one day, when I told my friend about what was happening, he said that if I stopped paying attention to it, then it would disappear in no time. So that was what I tried to do. No matter how much I felt eyes looking at me, I pretended they didn't exist, and it actually made me feel a little better. At least, until a few days later, when my friend told me that he had also seen the clown. My friend hadn't seen the video, only heard my story, and after that, he started seeing the clown on the edge of his vision. Not only that, but when I asked him what the clown looked like, it looked exactly the same as the one I'd been seeing too. I hadn't told him a single thing about what the clown looked like beforehand. The clown never went away, and unable to deal with its smiling face anymore, my friend took his own life from the stress. That clown still hasn't gone away. Whether I'm outside or inside doesn't matter. Wherever I am, it's watching me, looking at me with that smiling face that never changes. Can I still see it now? Yes, I can, and it's still smiling at me. It's looking at me from right behind you. When I was just a kid, I often went to stay at my mother's family home. My grandparents were apparently strict people, but they were always kind to me, and I loved them. My grandparents' house had been built several decades earlier, and it was so old that when my mother was a child, it apparently didn't even have a flush toilet. And in this house, there was a single shed. Inside it was old clothes, furniture, etc. And right in the back was a door. I tried to open the door when I found it while exploring, but it was locked and wouldn't budge. And so I asked my grandfather what that door was for, but the moment I did, his usual kind demeanor changed and he yelled at me, "Don't go near that door!" Being just a kid, I cried and quickly apologized, and after that, I didn't ask about the door again. About 10 years passed after that, and next thing I knew, I was back at my grandparents' house. I quickly realized it was a dream. It was one of those so-called lucid dreams. I was walking around the house I hadn't visited recently in my dream. Having returned to the times of my childhood, I suddenly remembered the shed I went inside, and the door that should have been locked now wasn't. I opened it, and there were stairs leading down into the ground. There was little light, but I went down and there was another door. At the bottom was one of those entrances for pets that you often see on doors overseas. I then realized something as I went to open this door. I could hear the sound of nails scratching on something. Listening closer, it was coming from the other side of the door. The sound was irregular, like somebody was seeking help. I got chills, and I turned back and left the shed without making a noise. The moment I realized I was drenched in sweat, I woke up. And just like in the dream, I was covered in sweat in real life too. At the time, I didn't realize what that dream meant. But a few days later, I heard that my grandfather's younger brother had died. I didn't even know that he had a younger brother, but according to my mother, he lived somewhere far away because of his mental health. And it was much later that I realized something else. In my mother's hometown, they had a custom long ago of confining people who suffered from mental health problems, or those who were born disabled. So maybe who I heard in my dream that time was... I still don't know the truth. My childhood friend Eiko used to live next door with her parents, but one day, a meteorite suddenly fell on their house. I say meteorite, but it was only a really small rock, and nobody was hurt either. It even made the papers at the time, and locals and even a TV station came around to see it. Things were busy for a while, but once all the fuss died down, things returned to normal. All except for Eiko and her family, that is. Eiko and her parents, who used to be so bright and cheerful, suddenly changed. I always walked to school with Eiko, and her mother would always cheerfully greet me in the mornings, but after that day, she stopped coming out to say hello. Eiko's father locked himself inside the house and stopped going outside as well. Eiko herself barely replied when I spoke to her, and she was always looking at the sky and muttering something. Before long, she stopped leaving the house as well. This went on for several days, and then I finally decided I would go and check on her. I pressed the doorbell, but there was no response. I tried the doorknob, and then the door opened with a small sound. I walked down the hall, careful not to make a sound, and peeked into the living room. Before me, Eiko and her parents sat watching white noise on TV, eating uncooked vegetables and meat. They turned to look at me as I screamed before I could stop myself. There was no life in their eyes, nor did they say anything, and then they turned back to watch the white noise on TV again. Scared, I ran out of the house, but I was too frightened to tell anyone what I'd seen, and so several days passed. Then one day, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night and realized there was a strange light on the other side of my window. I opened it and saw the light was coming from above Eiko's house. And beneath that light stood Eiko and her parents. Something didn't feel right, so I screamed Eiko's name. She turned to look at me, And then, the very next moment, she was gone. The light disappeared as well, and when I looked towards the sky, there appeared to be something flying away. I never saw Eiko again after that. I don't know if it was related to that meteorite, but sometimes when I look up at the sky, I stop and think, maybe there's something up there watching us.